The grand manor was adorned with sparkling chandeliers, cascading floral arrangements, and golden accents, a perfect reflection of the opulence Daniel had worked so hard to achieve. Guests in designer attire filled the room, their laughter and clinking glasses creating a celebratory atmosphere. Daniel, in a tailored tuxedo, stood at the center of it all, hand in hand with Sophie. His stunning bride, Sophie, was radiant in her custom-made gown, her smile dazzling as she mingled with the elite. Yet, amidst the glamour, Daniel felt a strange unease. As he glanced around the room, he couldn't help but think back to the simpler days of his life, the days when wealth and status weren't his sole focus. The thought lingered, a subtle discomfort he couldn't shake. While Sophie basked in the attention of their guests, Daniel's mind wandered to the long journey that had brought him to this point. From humble beginnings, he had clawed his way to the top, building a business empire that earned him both admiration and envy. But the cost of his ambition was a price he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. He glanced at Sophie, who was busy chatting with the senator's wife, and felt a pang of guilt. She deserved his undivided attention, yet his thoughts were elsewhere. He pushed the feeling aside, determined to enjoy the day, though the weight of something unspoken pressed against his chest. As the night wore on, Daniel moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and shaking hands. He tried to focus on the moment, but the unease refused to dissipate. Every smile felt forced, every laugh hollow. He told himself it was just wedding day nerves, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. This wedding was meant to symbolize a fresh start, a new chapter in his life. Yet, it felt as though the past was clawing at the edges of his perfect day, threatening to unravel the facade he had so carefully built. Daniel's world tilted on its axis when he spotted a familiar figure among the catering staff. She was bent over a table, wiping it down with deliberate, measured movements. Her hair, tied back in a messy bun, framed a face he had once known better than his own. Mia. For a moment, he thought he was imagining things. His ex-wife, here at his wedding? It seemed impossible. But as she straightened up and placed a tray on the table, her profile confirmed it. Her dark, glowing complexion, her soft almond-shaped eyes, now shadowed with fatigue. It was undoubtedly her. Then his gaze dropped to her swollen belly, and his breath hitched. She was pregnant. Mia didn't notice him at first, too focused on her task. But as Daniel continued to stare, unable to look away, she finally turned and froze. Their eyes met, and the shock in her expression mirrored his own. Her hand trembled slightly as she clutched the tray, and for a brief second, neither of them moved. Then, as if regaining her composure, Mia quickly averted her gaze and hurried away, blending into the crowd of servers. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Questions bombarded him. Why was she here? How could this be happening on his wedding day? And most pressing of all, whose child was she carrying? The rest of the reception became a blur. Daniel's focus was no longer on Sophie or their guests. His eyes scanned the room, searching for Mia, but she had seemingly vanished. His emotions were a chaotic mix of anger, guilt, and confusion. He couldn't understand why seeing her affected him so deeply. But it did. He tried to reason with himself, telling himself it was mere curiosity. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Mia's presence was a reminder of a chapter in his life he thought he had closed, a chapter that now seemed far from over. Daniel's mind was a storm of memories as he sat at the head table, barely noticing the toasts and laughter around him. His thoughts drifted to the days when Mia had been his world. He remembered the first time he saw her at a small cafe near his college campus. She had been laughing with friends, her warm, infectious smile lighting up the room. She was different from anyone he had ever met, grounded, compassionate, and endlessly supportive of his dreams. Their love had been passionate and intense, but it wasn't without its challenges. They had married young, full of hope but unprepared for the trials life would throw their way. As his ambition grew, so did the distance between them. Daniel had thrown himself into his work, often leaving Mia to fend for herself emotionally. He convinced himself it was for their future, but in reality, it was his own insecurities driving him to prove his worth. Mia had tried to hold on, but the cracks in their relationship deepened. He remembered the arguments, the nights she cried herself to sleep while he sat in his office, ignoring her pain. The memory of the day she left was etched into his mind. Her voice had trembled as she told him she couldn't stay in a marriage where she felt invisible. He hadn't stopped her, too proud to admit he was wrong. Now, seeing her at his wedding, pregnant and working as a server, the guilt hit him like a tidal wave. He had moved on. Or so he thought. But Mia's presence had reopened wounds he didn't even realize were still there. As the evening wore on, Daniel found himself questioning everything. Had he truly moved on, or had he simply buried the past, hoping it would never resurface? And why, despite all the pain, did seeing Mia ignite a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years? Regret. Longing. And an ache he couldn't explain. Daniel couldn't let the night end without confronting Mia. The weight of seeing her again, pregnant, working at his wedding reception, was too much to bear. After discreetly scanning the venue for what felt like hours, he finally spotted her near the kitchen entrance, quietly stacking empty trays. She seemed smaller, more fragile than he remembered, though there was still an air of resilience about her. He approached her cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mia," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes. She froze, her shoulders tensing before she turned to face him. Her expression was guarded, her eyes flickering with a mix of surprise and defiance. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp but tinged with something else, concern perhaps. Mia straightened her posture, meeting his gaze with quiet dignity. "I'm working, Daniel." "That much should be obvious," she replied coolly, though her voice betrayed a hint of unease. Daniel felt a surge of emotions, anger, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of protectiveness. "At my wedding? Why would you put yourself in this position?" he pressed, unable to understand why she hadn't simply walked away when she saw his name on the event list. Mia's lips tightened, and she shook her head. "I didn't have a choice. Not everyone gets to live in luxury, Daniel. Some of us have to take what we can get." Her words stung, cutting through his pride like a blade. He searched her face for answers, for any trace of the woman he had once loved. But all he saw was exhaustion and pain. Before he could ask the question burning in his mind, she stepped back, her hand resting protectively over her belly. "I have work to do," she said, turning away. Daniel watched her disappear into the kitchen, his heart heavy with questions he didn't yet have the courage to ask. And just like that, the past he had tried so hard to leave behind had come rushing back, along with all the consequences he thought he had escaped. Daniel stood frozen in place, his pulse hammering in his ears. The clatter of silverware and the distant hum of laughter from the ballroom felt like background noise compared to the storm raging inside him. He wanted to chase after Mia, demand answers, but something in the way she had held herself, proud yet weary, stopped him. Instead, he clenched his fists and exhaled sharply. This wasn't the time. Not with Sophie watching. Not with the weight of his carefully constructed life pressing down on him. He turned back toward the reception, slipping into the role he had perfected over the years. The charming, self-assured businessman who had everything under control. But he felt anything but in control. Sophie was waiting for him at the head table, her eyes shining with joy as she spoke with her friends. When she noticed him, she reached for his hand. "Where did you run off to?" she asked. Her voice light, teasing. Daniel forced a smile. "Just checking on things," he said, the lie rolling off his tongue effortlessly. Sophie grinned, squeezing his hand. "I can't believe we're finally married. Everything is perfect, isn't it?" Perfect. The word rang hollow in his ears. He wanted to say yes to reassure her. But all he could think about was Mia, with her tired eyes and a belly that carried a child he might have had a part in creating. The thought sent another jolt through him. He needed to know. But how? He glanced around, scanning the room, but Mia was nowhere in sight. Had she already left? Then, an idea struck him. The catering company. He pulled out his phone under the table and discreetly searched for the name printed on the staff's aprons. It took only a few minutes before he found their contact information. Without hesitation, he sent a quick email to the manager, requesting the employee list for the night's event under the guise of thanking the staff personally. His hands trembled as he put his phone away. He had no idea what he would do with the information once he had it. All he knew was that he couldn't let this go. After the last toast had been made and the guests had begun to trickle out of the grand manor, Daniel excused himself under the pretense of handling business calls. Sophie was too caught up in saying goodbye to their guests to notice his distraction. He found a quiet corner outside, his phone buzzing with a reply from the catering manager. Mia Carter, server, shift ended at 11 p.m. Carter. She had gone back to her maiden name. His throat tightened as he copied down the address listed for employees. Likely a formality, but it was something. Before he could talk himself out of it, he called his driver. "I need a ride," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside him. Mia's small one-bedroom apartment was on the outskirts of town, a stark contrast to the world Daniel now lived in. He sat in the back of his sleek black sedan, staring at the dimly lit windows, his heart pounding. What was he doing here? He could walk away. Pretend he never saw her. Pretend none of this mattered. But then he saw her silhouette pass by the window, and something inside him refused to let go. He got out of the car. Each step toward her door felt heavier than the last. He knocked once, twice. Silence. Then, after a long pause, the door cracked open. Mia stood there in an oversized sweater and leggings, her hair still tied back, exhaustion etched into her features. Her expression shifted from surprise to guarded suspicion. "Daniel?" Her voice was quiet, but firm. He swallowed hard. "Can we talk?" Mia hesitated, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "There's nothing left to say." "There's everything left to say," he countered. His gaze dropped to her belly. "Is it mine?" A flicker of emotion crossed her face. Anger, pain, something else he couldn't quite place. "It doesn't matter," she finally said. Daniel took a step forward. "It does to me." Mia let out a bitter laugh. "Now it does? After all these years? After you moved on, built your perfect life with someone else?" She shook her head. "You don't get to waltz back in and demand answers." "Daniel, I'm not demanding. I just need to know," he said, his voice raw. Mia's eyes softened for a brief second before hardening again. "You're too late." She moved to close the door, but he caught it, his palm flat against the wood. "Please, Mia." She sighed, looking down for a long moment before finally stepping aside. 5 minutes, she muttered. Daniel stepped inside, feeling the weight of the past crash down on him. This was his chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. Daniel stepped inside, his eyes scanning the modest apartment. The furniture was old but well kept. A small couch sat in the corner, and a pile of baby clothes rested on the coffee table. The sight of them twisted something deep inside him. Mia closed the door and folded her arms, keeping her distance. "Say what you need to say." He exhaled slowly, trying to gather his thoughts. "I didn't expect to see you tonight," he admitted. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Neither did I." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Is it mine?" he asked again, softer this time. Mia's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Yes." The word hit him like a thunderclap. His heart pounded in his chest, and he struggled to find air. "How far along are you?" 7 months, she said, her tone unreadable. 7 months. That meant... It happened before Sophie. Before the engagement. Before everything. Daniel sank onto the couch, rubbing his temples. Why didn't you tell me? Mia scoffed. Would you have cared, Daniel? You were too busy building your empire, moving on with your perfect fiancé. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. Mia's eyes flashed. Isn't it? The last time we spoke, you didn't even look back. I walked away, Daniel. I left because you let me. And now you expect me to believe you would have dropped everything for this? She gestured toward her belly. Guilt clawed at his insides. She wasn't wrong. Back then, he was a different man. He had let ambition consume him, convinced that love could wait. But now, standing in this room, seeing the life growing inside of her, he realized just how much he had lost. Daniel swallowed hard. I would have done something. Mia laughed bitterly. That's easy to say now. Silence stretched between them. Finally, he looked up, meeting her gaze. What do you need? Money? A better place? Medical care? Her expression hardened. I don't need your charity. It's not charity, he argued. It's responsibility. Mia's lips trembled, but she lifted her chin. I've been doing this alone, Daniel. I didn't come to you because I didn't need you. And I still don't. His stomach twisted. Mia. I got a job, I pay my bills, and I don't need you swooping in at the last minute trying to fix things. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the strength she was trying so hard to hold on to. Daniel stood, closing the distance between them. I wasn't there before. I get that. But I want to be here now. Mia searched his face, her own expression unreadable. And what about Sophie? The name felt like a slap. Daniel hesitated. I don't know. Mia shook her head. Then figure it out. Because I won't let you play hero in my life while you go home to her. The words were a dagger to his chest. For the first time that night, Daniel realized this wasn't just about the baby. This was about them. About the love they had lost. The pain he had caused. And the impossible choice that now lay before him. Daniel stood frozen in place, Mia's words hanging in the air like an accusation, like a challenge. Then figure it out. How could he? How could he just walk away from Sophie, the woman he had promised a future to, when Mia was standing right in front of him, carrying his child? His hands curled into fists at his sides. I need time. Mia let out a bitter laugh. Time? You had time, Daniel. Months. Years. But now you're only here because you ran into me by accident. He flinched. She was right. If fate hadn't thrown them together tonight, he wouldn't have known about the baby at all. But he did know now. And there was no going back. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and firm. I won't disappear, Mia. Whether you like it or not, I have a responsibility, to you and to our child. Mia's eyes flickered with something, pain, uncertainty, exhaustion. I don't need you, she whispered. But this time, her voice lacked conviction. He exhaled, rubbing his face. Maybe not. But our baby does. Silence stretched between them. A car horn blared in the distance, the city alive beyond the walls of her small apartment. Mia's shoulders sagged slightly. I don't know what you want from me, Daniel. He swallowed hard. I want to be in my child's life. She studied him, searching for any sign of hesitation. Finally, she sighed. Then prove it. When Daniel returned to the wedding suite, Sophie was already waiting for him, slipping out of her gown and into a silk robe. She looked up, smiling softly. There you are, she said. I thought you got lost. Daniel forced a smile, but it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. Sophie walked toward him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Tonight was perfect, she murmured. I can't wait to start our life together. His stomach twisted. The words that should have made him happy only filled him with dread. Mia's face flashed in his mind. The baby? The life he had abandoned once already. Sophie pulled back slightly, studying his face. Daniel. Is something wrong? He hesitated. This was the moment. He could bury the truth and pretend nothing had changed. He could wake up tomorrow and be the devoted husband everyone expected him to be. Or he could tell her everything. He took a shaky breath, his heart pounding. Sophie. We need to talk. Her smile faltered. Talk about what? Daniel's throat felt tight. About my past. And my future. Sophie's expression darkened. Daniel, you're scaring me. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. I saw Mia tonight. Sophie's face paled. Your ex-wife? Here? He nodded slowly. She was working the event. And Sophie. He hesitated, but there was no way around it. He had to say it. She's pregnant. Sophie's entire body went rigid. What? His voice was barely above a whisper. And it's mine. For a moment, everything was still. Then Sophie took a step back, her face twisting in shock, disbelief, and something else, betrayal. Tell me you're joking. Daniel could only shake his head. Sophie's breathing turned uneven. So what, Daniel? You find out your ex is pregnant, and suddenly everything changes? He swallowed. I don't know. Sophie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I should have known. I should have seen it. She stepped back, her hands trembling. What are you going to do? Daniel's chest felt heavy. I don't have an answer yet. Sophie's eyes burned with emotion. Then figure it out. But don't expect me to wait around while you decide which life you want to live. She turned sharply, grabbing her things, her movements quick and decisive. Sophie waited, but she didn't. The door slammed shut behind her, and just like that, the life Daniel had built, the perfect, controlled future he had planned, began to crumble. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he wanted to stop it. The morning light streamed through the hotel suite's windows, casting long shadows over the half-empty room. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, his mind a storm of thoughts. Sophie was gone. Their perfect life, the one he had carefully constructed, was unraveling faster than he could grasp. And at the center of it all was Mia. For years he had convinced himself that his past with her was nothing more than a closed chapter, a love story that had burned too bright and ended too soon. But seeing her again, carrying his child, had shattered that illusion. He had a choice to make. One path led back to the world he had built, wealth, status, and a future with Sophie if she ever forgave him. A life of polished perfection but hollow at its core. The other led to Mia. To the woman he had once loved, the woman carrying his child. A life that was uncertain, messy, and full of unknowns, but real. Daniel had spent so long chasing success that he had forgotten what truly mattered. With a deep breath, he reached for his phone and dialed a familiar number. Mia answered after the third ring, her voice cautious. Daniel? He swallowed. Can we talk? A pause. Then, finally, all right. He stood, grabbing his jacket, his decision made. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't choosing wealth or power. He was choosing love. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip away.